All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I don't want to say a full room of prayer, but we're going to go forego the prayer this evening because it is our last night of Kings and Prophets. And for some reason, I decided, as we're studying Judah and Exile, we're going to try and cram all of Daniel and Ezekiel into one night. So we'll see how it goes. Where we left off last week, the Babylonians have conquered Judah, but we're going to have to rewind a little bit because though Daniel and Ezekiel are prophesied while they're in exile, Jeremiah doesn't act. The end of Jeremiah doesn't happen until they're already prophesying. And so it's like a weird overlap. So we'll first talk about Daniel. Ezekiel and Daniel share a lot of similarities, but Daniel, he is a part of the first band to be, I guess, taken into exile by the Babylonians. So is Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a part of another band. But Daniel is the first one to, or is part of the first wave that goes to actually Babylon. And so he is prophesying in Babylon. Daniel is there. He gets called by the Lord. Just a heads up, some of these pictures depict Daniel as a child. That's not at all what's happening. But you can only ask for so much when you're looking for pictures. And some of them are more advanced children's ministry graphics for Daniel, which I get. But Daniel is a man. Just some notes about the book of Daniel. Daniel, for being a major prophet, is actually shorter than some of the minor prophets, so that's a little weird. But I think he got to bump up to major prophet because it's just one of those books. It's a doozy to go through. But what we see is there's actually three portions, two in Hebrew and one in Aramaic. Aramaic is a cousin language of Hebrew. So it's not like the Israelites wouldn't know it. Aramaic actually comes from Aram, which is that northern Syrian bit. So they shared a lot of language, culture, little things, especially because they kind of ended up getting mixed forcibly together because, well, when the Assyrians come through and there's suddenly no borders, and then the Babylonians come through and they're just saying, all these people who are here, you're leaving together. It kind of mixes. Some will say that this means there's multiple authors. I'm not going to go that far. But how it's broken up is what you see is chapter 1, it's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're taken. It's the four of them. Kind of gives us a background on those guys and explains that they are becoming, they're selected to serve Babylon. They're identified as, oh, these guys are pretty good at what they're doing. They seem educated. They're not really grunt workers, but they're useful to the Babylonians. And then you get the portion in Aramaic in which we have kind of, it's a chiasm. And I tried to show that here, but I got tired of trying to make the shapes work. And so what I did is just paired them off, where you can kind of see if we were to put it on its side. A chiasm is just a staggered part or a literary work where the beginning copies the end. So you have chapter 2 matching with chapter 7, and you have 3 and 6, and then 4 and 5. And they mirror each other in the fact that chapter 2 and 7 relate to dreams, and they're the same kind of message. There's 4 of something. Well, I guess Nebuchadnezzar's is 6. 6 of something, and it's foretelling of the destruction of these nations. And then you have 3 and 6 that go together. It's a testing of faith for the Jews in these chapters versus Babylonians. And then you have Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar's pride. The pride of a ruler and how it works with God. Then you have chapters 8 through 12. You have two visions and a prayer, in which the prayer is kind of a vision because things are revealed in the prayer to Daniel, but it's still one of those moments where there's a lot that it's still not technically a vision because he's not seeing anything. He's just receiving feedback. However, the way it probably should be broken up into is chapters 1, 3, and 6 is the discussion of a worldly life versus a godly life. Chapters 4 and 5 talk about pride versus humility. And then chapters 2, 7, 8, 9, and 10 through 12 are visions and prayers and dreams, I guess. This is the stuff we think of when we think of prophets. That's what I think. Because that's what happens for most of them. You're seeing something, you're interpreting dreams, you're doing that portion of the work. So we'll go ahead and spend some time breaking down the first section of Daniel, which is focusing on a worldly life versus a godly life. Again, chapter 1 introduces us to 4 young men at this time because they're being taken into exile. By the end of Daniel is not young; he's old. He has lived throughout the time of the exile, and he is tired. To say, he's tired. Interestingly enough, we know Daniel's Hebrew name, but we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's Babylonian, and so it's one of those. I just wanted to include it because it is a little confusing because there's Belteshazzar, which is Daniel, but if we look back, there's Belshazzar, which is slightly different, but one has a T, and that's the king of or Nebuchadnezzar's son. So it's not. So we have these 4, and they'll be split up eventually because Daniel becomes acknowledged more. But their first interaction, again, it looks like it's the Goonies talking to the king and the king's court of Babylon. I don't think they were that young, but they are younger than old men. So it's somewhere in there. But what's happening is these 4 are being tested. They've been brought up into the king's court of Nebuchadnezzar. They are no longer focusing on, or they're separated from their country. They're not surrounded by those who used to be priests, those who used to be in the temple. Those are no longer the people. They're not with their neighbors anymore. They're fully surrounded by Babylonians. And all these Babylonians are surrounding them saying, eat of this food, the king's food. This is good food. This is meat of pigs and wild beasts and all of the things. And what ends up happening is they have to stand firm and say, no, this is not what we are to eat. We are to eat. And they actually go further and take more of a super conservative, I guess, is a way of putting it, a super conservative view of what they're to eat. They're to only eat vegetables and salads, basically, which I would cave in if I had to pick between a salad and not salad. But it's one of those. They stood firm. They showed their faith, and that's kind of what happens in chapter 1 of Daniel. And we see that ends up being rewarded. Their steadfastness to the Torah is rewarded. And that's kind of the pattern with 1, 3, and 6. Is faithfulness to God is rewarded, but you are being tested with the things of the world. Going on to chapter 3, again, not necessarily 1, but 3 and 6 are definitely the ones we hear from Bible, not Bible school, Sunday school, whatever it's called. So chapter 3 is the story of Meshach, Meshach, and Abednego. I said it out of order. and they're brought before the statues of King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar wants everyone to worship him like a god. This happens a lot when emperors get full of themselves. We see it with Rome, we see it with Greece, we see it like all of the emperors tend to reach a point where they think of themselves as gods. And so they build a statue and they demand everyone needs to bow down, which is something to consider. If they're in Babylon, surely by this point more exiled Jews have reached Babylon, yet the way it's framed is only 3 people stand up. And it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so not only are they standing up in a crowd of Babylonians, they're showing their faith is greater even than other Jews. Other people have followed or have come to Babylon, which kind of makes sense. I'm sure there's a lot of Jews that were ready to just write off God, right? Jerusalem's been under siege. We've lost our land. We are no longer being treated like the select or the select portion of God. It's hard to say with pride, I'm a Jew, right? And so it's one of those moments, I'm sure, where their faith was weak. Well, except for these 3. These 3 are firm in their faith. They're firm with what they know is right. They're firm with what they know they're supposed to be doing. Everyone else may be falling off the cliff because that's where the first guy went, but they are standing firm knowing that I'm not going to go jump off the cliff just because someone's told me to. They're standing firm. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar gets very angry. And it's one of those, they decide, let's take this royal furnace. And so either one could assume that this is wintertime for this to be the central heating system for the palace. This could have been considered more of a smelting furnace, if we're wanting to say, well, he is an emperor in time of war, so he's collecting all this metals, and so of course we have to burn it down. But that doesn't quite make sense if it's in the palace. It's also one of those, is it in the palace or is it just near the palace? Is this an oven where they're cooking food or would have cooked food? Great question. It's one of those, we know there's a furnace. We know that they are turning up the heat. They're putting it at the hottest that this furnace can handle, which is, if we're thinking of this as like the central heating furnace of a palace, those are built to get hot. Like their whole design is to get as hot as possible. And so to even push that furnace to the limit, it's one of those, what we kind of see at the end when the guards are told to pull out the 3. It's so hot that the guards are struggling to get near the furnace. But what happens is they throw in the 3, and it's been a while, and Nebuchadnezzar's like, so what's happening? I'm not hearing screaming. I'm not smelling the burning of flesh, which kind of makes it seem like he's done this before. And so it's just one of those moments where he's losing his temper. He loses his temper a lot. But what we see is the 3 are thrown into the fire. The guards approach. They're not burned. Nothing has been singed. You couldn't even tell that they were in the furnace other than you were looking in the furnace. And they see a 4th individual. This will lead me to a soapbox, so warning in advance. There's some who will say this is somehow Daniel got in here. I don't think that's what it is. Because Daniel wasn't with them in the beginning. Daniel's the main character of the book of Daniel. So you would think Daniel would be mentioned if he was in the furnace. But what I think, and I'm not alone, but I will go into a soapbox moment. This is the pre-incarnate Christ. Christ is making himself known and is being seen in the furnace, and his actions are being seen even in the Old Testament, which this is the soapbox. So I'll stand over here. Christ is apparent and working in the Old Testament through all of it. He works a lot with prophets, and he's with Moses, he's with Joshua. Like, we see him show up over and over again in different forms. It's just not the incarnate fleshly Christ. And this is the moment where, Christ he's appearing human. He's not actually human. He has the appearance of the human. But this I'll jump forward to Ezekiel. This is something that we see with Ezekiel too. And I'm sure it had to be something like, why is the glory of God? Why is God physically manifesting, visually manifesting, whatever? Why is he being manifested in Babylon? Ezekiel struggles with this, but we'll talk about Ezekiel here later, because we have to get through some of these visions of Daniel. And then we get Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6 under Belshazzar. We have evil officials who don't like that Daniel has all this authority, and they're seeing Daniel's, I guess one could call it religiosity, or just what we consider faithfulness to God. They don't like how it makes him look better than he is, or to what they think he's better than he is. Because what he's doing is he's dedicated to prayer life. He's dedicated to keeping himself away from vices. He's not out drinking or partying or being promiscuous. He is being reserved. He doesn't take a spouse. He's not obsessed with worldly things. He's not concerned with money. He doesn't take bribes. Like, they hate how Daniel is so straight on the path. Like, he doesn't waver from what he's set out to do. And so they make up a false claim that, well, King Belshazzar, Daniel has said this about you, and so we need to throw him into the lion's den. And then, of course, we get God seals the lion's mouths. So they don't eat for however long. I'm blanking on the time currently, but they do not eat. They do not make any noise while Daniel is in the lion's den. And the king basically seals the grave like this is going to be the death of Daniel. And the king he has a hard time about it because he knows that Daniel has done nothing but good. So King Belshazzar, I guess it's Belshazzar's son. I misspoke earlier. Belshazzar is assassinated after he has his dream. So, and we'll get there in a second. But what we see is Daniel, once he's brought out, the king says, well, he's a good official. These two who conspired against him, they're wicked. They must be now thrown into the lion's den. And then God opens the seal of the mouths, and the lions almost instantly devour them. And so it's one of those, because the lions had not eaten anything for a while. And it's one of those night and day moments, I guess. But then we see, I'll try and power through some of this. Chapter 4 and 5, we see two kings who have struggles with pride and their relationship with God. Nebuchadnezzar starts off, he gets another dream. It's his second dream. That's recorded in Daniel. And he sees a tree. It's a strong tree, it's growing, and then he sees it being chopped down by an axe. And it's clearly a strong axe. It's having very little resistance against this tree. It lops off the branches. It is scattering and breaking up this tree, but it doesn't destroy it completely. It leaves the stump. And the message is, there's Nebuchadnezzar, you are the axe. You are this force that Babylon has been the axe to scatter, to break down, to destroy the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, because they have grown to be wicked. Though their ancestors are there, but you will not destroy Judah. You will not destroy the Jews, because out of there will be a stump, and out of that stump will a promised line, a stronger line, a more full tree will come. And so what happens is Nebuchadnezzar Ezekiel gets a boost. He thinks he's all that because, God's saying, I am the tool of God. He's starting to hear rumors, what people are saying about him, even amongst the Jews. because we saw it in Jeremiah this week, and we've seen it a couple of times. Nebuchadnezzar is considered a servant of the Lord. Like, that's not something to be stopped at. Like, Jews are having to come to terms with this foreign king, this evil emperor is being called a servant of the Lord. This is what Moses was called. Like, we're putting Nebuchadnezzar and Moses in the same sentence, and it's hard for them to take. And so that leads Nebuchadnezzar, as his pride becomes greater and greater, God decides to punish him, and he follows his own desires. He resorts to more of an animalistic instinct. And it's one of those God curses him to the fact that he doesn't hit that point where he realizes I've become an animal. He just becomes like an animal. He becomes like an ox who feeds off the grass, which I'm sure had to be hard for some of those guards, but to still protect him because he is still the king. But he's like, this guy is insane, and he's eating grass like he's an ox. He's living like he's a wild man, and it comes to the point where it breaks Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar cries out to God, and he says, "God, forgive me. I must humble myself before you. I have become prideful. I do not want to be eating grass. I don't want to be like a beast." And so God returns him to his state years later, because this is over years. But it's kind of short-lived. Nebuchadnezzar is like dead in the next chapter, because we get Belteshazzar, and he's again prideful. He's kind of like some of the king of this Rehoboam and with Solomon. He saw that his father did bad and kind of learned his lesson at the end, but it's still one of those, yeah, that's great and all, but I'm going to still enjoy the lavish lifestyle. I'm going to exploit the people. I'm going to do whatever I want. And what happens is one night while he's holding court, they're having a party. A hand from heaven is described as reaching down and writing down 3 words, and it's measured, divided, and scattered. Because the Babylon will be measured, it will be scattered, and it will be divided. It's a message. And then he's like, yeah, I know this is from God, and it just appeared in Hebrew on my wall, a language I don't speak. And so I had to call on a prophet of God, and he told me what this means, and I need to repent, but I'm not going to. I'm going to remain prideful. I'm going to remain this, and he's shortly assassinated after. He meets his end pretty quick because he doesn't learn his lesson. That was not what I wanted to do. Sorry. That leads us to the dreams and visions. I'll turn around the board now. And hopefully you can read my handwriting. Because there's a lot of dreams and visions that we kind of need to talk about. What good am I doing you if I'm not talking about Daniel's dreams and visions? Because there's a lot. First, we'll talk about Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. Again, we've kind of talked about the second dream already, how Babylon was the axe, the means of destroying the tree, and the future promises there will be a return of Israel, a return of a promised king from this remnant, which kind of echoes back to Elijah. Even now, in the most wicked time under Ahab, I have reserved a remnant. It's just kind of calling us back to that a little, as Daniel. There will be a remnant that returns. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he sees a statue, very similar to the statue he had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worship. It's of a king. It's one of those, he doesn't quite see himself in it, but he does see this is a king of Babylon. This is a king of nations. This is probably where you got the idea, because this happens in chapter 2. The statue is built in chapter 3. But what we see in this dream is it's made out of 5 different forms. There's a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron. There's feet of clay, and then suddenly a rock flies in from out of screen, and it destroys the statue. And so what this is usually tending to point to is the head of gold is Babylon. Babylon is the strongest empire to, I guess, have dominion over Judah. Just because these four, and then there's a fifth, which we don't know. It's a future kingdom that will happen because, but as it goes on, we see it in history. Each empire gets slightly weaker as the time goes on because they don't necessarily care about, like, they're not there to punish the Jews, they're just there. Babylon was raised up to punish the Jews, to destroy the kingdom of Judah, to destroy the kingdom of Israel. And so what we see is the head of gold, the strongest, most elegant. This is Babylon. Then we get the chest and arms of silver. This is often considered, it's the Persians because they're next. But they're, the idea is that they project strength wherever they go. They're masters of chariots. They are well known for they project strength. You have thighs of bronze with grease. That one's a little harder to get why, but it's just, I think part of it's, we're looking at history, we're looking at the prophecy, and like, oh, well, they're next. And so it's one of those. And then Rome is, of course, iron. Everything Rome had was iron. Like that one's a little bit easier. Gladiators wore iron armor. Centurions wore iron armor. Swords were everything was iron. Of course, and then there's a future kingdom. There's debate on whether this is, some will say, well, this is the Ottomans or the Arabs or however we want to argue that. Some will argue, well, no, this is just more of a loosely confederated group that holds onto the land of Israel. It's unclear. All we know is that they're feet of clay, so the weakest ones to have a claim on Israel. The weakest ones, they're not really there to punish, but it's when the feet are in control, or the clay, that's when the Messiah, the Messianic kingdom returns. It's because that's where the rock hits. The rock hits the feet and it causes all of it to crumble. Because then Israel is no longer under occupation, or the people of Israel are no longer under occupation. We'll go on to the next one. The next one is the one that connects to Revelation a lot. It's the four beasts, or I guess you could argue five. First, you have the lion with wings like eagles. That's Babylon. Babylon, they love their cherubim. Like it's one of those things that we found cherubim wherever. They kind of influenced our understanding of cherubim. Well, their cherubim were lions with the wings of eagles. Like that was their throne guardians. That's what they built in temples. That's kind of, the bald eagle is our kind of like national animal. Well, theirs was a lion with eagle wings. The other ones, not so much, because they're just meant to represent a different form of beast. Because the next one, Persia is not known for their bears, especially bears with 3 ribs in their mouth. It's just meant to be, which this is another side. All of the others are like really super mythical creatures, and this one's just a bear. And so I think that kind of goes to the argument of you don't want to ever have to fight a bear. And so, but the idea is there's a bear. The 3 ribs represent, some will argue, 3 nations, 3 people groups. Persia conquers a lot. And so it's, find someone, you can find an argument for 3 different nations that Persia conquered before they defeated the Babylonians. You can find whatever. It's really, we're missing the point. It's just another beast comes, because it's described, each beast comes and causes more damage. So this bear comes and defeats the lion with eagle wings, and then crushes everything else behind it. And it is defeated by a leopard with 4 heads and several birds' wings. And so it's one of those, Greece is kind of prophesied as 4 in 1, a lot more than some of the other kingdoms. And part of this is because when Alexander the Great dies, Greece is divided into 4 portions. And so it's one of those, right now it's one, but it's going to be four. We'll see this in Daniel's second dream, which again, we'll get there in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is Greece. This is very clearly it. And then you get a dragon with iron claws and iron teeth. It has 10 horns, and it's stronger than the rest. Rome was stronger than the rest. It's hard to say. But what we see is there's 10 horns, and 10 horns are the 10th horn is supposed to be what will become the Antichrist, or at least in Revelation. Looking at Daniel, it's one of those, it's kind of weird that one of them has the face of the human. And so it's one of those bones, because this dragon is afflicting the Son of Man. And the Son of Man is supposed to be, of course, Christ. And at the end of time, the 10th horn will be defeated, and the Son of Man will take its place at the right hand of God. That's kind of where some of this comes from in Daniel. Looking forward, the 10th horn, some will argue this means there's supposed to be 10 nations that come after Rome that will be to the 10th one will be the one where the Antichrist appears. Well, then you get the problem of, well, when did Rome fall? Because Rome, the city, fell several times. The empire kept changing hands, though, because there's the Eastern Roman Empire that lasts much longer. It lasted the 14th century. And then you get the problem of, well, then they also technically transferred their power via the church to Russia. So then what is the Russian Empire now properly Rome? And then you get into the problem of, well, then there's also the claim by the Moans, because there's a moment in which the Pope claims that he is the rightful seat to the Empire of Rome, and the Pope then crowns Charlemagne, Emperor of Rome, and he's the one who gets to choose. And then Charlemagne, which is now his kingdom, was France, and so is it France that's Rome? And so which one is? When are we starting to count the 10? And so it's one of those. But you can argue, you can count world powers throughout history, and it's probably not counting Russia and France as being the Roman Empire. But it's still then one of those. Well, then we're not that far off, but the things of God are a mystery to us, and they shall remain a mystery until God reveals them to us. And so Daniel's dream, to an extent, Revelation throws a lot of people off because of this imagery. They start trying to calculate exactly when God will be coming back, because most people don't like suffering. I don't know about you. I don't either. And so it's one of those, that's what they're trying to calculate. But then what we see is he has another dream. This happens in Daniel chapter 8. This is a second vision, and he sees a ram fighting a goat. But the goat has his normal goat horns, but then he has one that makes him look like a unicorn. It's one squarely in the center of his head, and the ram goes up to him, and they're fighting. But it's one of those moments where, one, it's weird that similar to the vision of, Persia's just a bear. Well, they're represented as just being a ram. Like it's not a ram with wings or anything. It's just a ram. And what this kind of is foreshadowing, because this is nearing the part where Persia has taken over Babylon, which means it's very much Daniel is no longer young, and because we'll see that in chapter 9. Daniel starts praying for, please let me go home to Israel, to the promised land. It's been 70 years, God, let me go home. Or more likely, let me die or let me go home. Like, I'm tired of living. But before he prays that, he has this vision. What happens is the ram loses, but kind of. What happens is the horn is broken and becomes four. Again, it's Greece, because Persia is defeated by Greece. But Alexander also dies fighting, or as he's on his conquest in Persia. And so Greece falls into four different areas, and just in time for Rome to come to power. Because it's one of those, Persia is not the end of this. There will be Greece, and you need to recognize that, Daniel. And then, of course, Daniel prays. He learns that, yes, even in exile, even though we've learned the lesson, that God is having to extend how long certain people are in exile. And so it's one of those, yeah, it's been 70 years, and people will start returning to Israel. The Jews will be released by Cyrus. So, as of we were talking about the return of exile in a short mini-series starting next week, probably in the same room. Actually, I think it is in the same room. So we'll talk about this next week. But there's three main waves coming back. And so, yeah, Cyrus releases the Jews, and there's a wave that goes back. But that wave, it doesn't have a ruler. It doesn't have a priest. They're not rebuilding Jerusalem. And that doesn't come until Ezra and Nehemiah start beating groups back. And then you get, Judah, or at this time it's now Judea, has been formed. Jerusalem has been returned to power. There's no longer a threat. And so that's kind of what Daniel is being taught. And of course, now he is old, but he still has time for one more lovely vision, which means we will have to race through Ezekiel. But he has one last vision, and what happens is a king of the north rises to power generations down the road. Some will say this is the same as Gog and Magog from Ezekiel. Some will say this is some other northern king. Because what happens is, we see, because now at this point, Daniel has seen the fall of Babylon. Cyrus has become emperor he hasn't become. He is emperor over Babylon and all of Babylonian territory. Cyrus is emperor of Persia, but he sees even after him, Alexander the Great will come, a great Greek ruler will come, and another ruler will come, and another, and there will be a series of lesser kings and greater kings, and none will be as victorious as Alexander the Great was. However, you see this struggle and power dynamic of this is generations down the line, looking ahead. But there's a king from the north, which sadly, Jerusalem is kind of in the middle of everything. And so kings from the north and south, that could be literally. And so it's, because if we want to go directly north, there's Lebanon, but there's also Syria, there's also Turkey, there's also Russia. If we're talking north based on where they are on the globe, all of Europe's also technically north of Jerusalem. All of Africa and most of Asia is south of Jerusalem. And then we're not even talking about the other side of the globe and who's north and south of Jerusalem. And a great king, a wicked king, great being super powerful, not that he was great in the sense he did good, comes to power, leading armies from the north and from the south to crush Jerusalem. However, in the final days, as it seems like all hope is lost, they will be destroyed. They will be killed. The king, evil will be stamped out. And so what we see is some lessons in Daniel. We are to deny the things of the world. We are to pursue God. We are to humble ourselves before God. There are several evil kings and empires, and they will act like beasts. God's kingdom will bring destruction to the beasts and those who follow wickedness. And that's Daniel. Surprised we got through it in 43 minutes. Ezekiel. Ezekiel, a little bit weirder. He's again part of the first group let out of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Jerusalem hasn't quite fallen. However, they're starting to take exiles now. As we saw a couple weeks ago, there's several layers of the city. And so, of course, the kings are holed up near the temple, and so are the wealthy, and all of these have been able to find shelter. This is probably around the same time Jeremiah is being kidnapped and taken to Egypt. But what we see is Ezekiel is now in Babylon, and on his 30th birthday, he sees, as he's sitting next to a river, God's throne descending from heaven. And it's described as there's four wheels of fire that are in every direction. Some might call them spears. Some think they're just two wheels that have intersected. I don't know. But there's cherubims, and they're covering the feet, and they're flying, and it's covering their faces, and there's a human head, there's a bull head, and there's an eagle head, and a lion head on all of them, and they cry out, behold the glory of God. And Ezekiel's first thought is not, wow, this is really cool. It's, why is God in Babylon? Like, why am I seeing him in a foreign country? But what happens is God delivers them a message. And you are to see, his message is that my people have become wicked. Their hearts have been hardened. And you are to be my prophet. You are to speak to my people. And in chapter 11, what happens, this is kind of dividing points. God comes and tells Ezekiel, I have left tells him kind of, it's more like he saw, because God showed it to him, that the glory of God has left the temple in Jerusalem. This is a heartbreaking moment for Ezekiel, because he was going to be a priest. On his 30th birthday, he would have been installed as a priest in the temple. And he's being shown the glory of God, that God's spirit has left the temple. It has left the ark, which again, we can go into the argument of this is also a sign of God doesn't have to be in the temple. God does not have to be in a certain place. God is just where God wants to be. And God wants to be everywhere. Pretty simple things. But what we see is then from moving forward is kind of a section of judgment and a section of hope. It's not a chiasm because they don't start where they end. It's more of just there's some parallelism. And you have a section of judgment from chapter 12 through 32. Chapters 12 through 24 is judgment on Israel. God breaks out the record and says, my people have done all of this. They have done wicked things. And he starts sharing parables. Ezekiel has to kind of be the lawyer for God, which is kind of weird to think about. It's more of, he is, in the court of public opinion, Ezekiel is representing God, and the people are supposed to be defending themselves before God. Ezekiel is making the case, you have been like a burnt stick, which is useless. You can't start a fire with it. You can't build with it. It's pointless. You've been like a promiscuous wife. You have snuck around with other gods. You were supposed to be married to God. You were supposed to be a covenant relationship, and you have snuck out on it. You were supposed to be. What has happened is like a lion who's been caught in a net. Danger is on the brink, and you're trying to wrangle this lion. You will be destroyed because of it. You have become like two promiscuous sisters, which is kind of weird to think because you already kind of hit the promiscuous part. But I'm not going to question it. I'm just realizing I put judgment of Israel on there twice. Yeah, it's promiscuous sisters. You're doing wrong. How many ways can God put this? You're doing wrong. You've become useless. You've awoken something dangerous. Chapters 25 to 32 is supposed to be a judgment on the nations. And it starts off, you list the immediate neighbors. This is the Philistines, this is the Sidonians, this is the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites. These are the same people who've kind of been there the whole time. They've been prophesied to over and over again. And they kind of get it easy. Their judgment is, you were supposed to be my people's brothers. You were supposed to be nations, because Edom was of Esau's line. You have the Ammonites who they had made covenants with, or they had become allies of Judah and Israel just kind of out of necessity. So where were you when I still worked in you? I still worked in Philistia. I still worked in these nations. Where were you to tell my people, hey, you've done wrong? Where were you in all this? Why weren't you doing your role? But the main focus is you have Tyre, which has become kind of not an empire, but it's become a very powerful influence in the north. They have the magic of sea travel and what it does. Like there are books that have been written about how just having boats changes the scenario. Like being able to trade, being able to transport troops on water, like it changes the game. It's why the United States Navy is both the strongest Navy in the world and the second largest Air Force in the world. Like having a Navy is important. I guess it doesn't really make sense because they weren't flying, but it's the same idea of like you want to build your Navy up. You want a strong Navy, and Tyre has become a strong Navy. And Egypt has become a strong empire kingdom, however you want to define it, in the south. They have become an influence in the south, and they have been the example that the kings of Judah and kings of Israel were looking towards. They were saying, we don't want to be the kingdom of God. We want to be like Egypt. We want to be like Tyre. And so God kind of rips into them. And it's very much this is not right, this is not good. And then we get a break. Chapter 33 happens, and what happens is Ezekiel, while he's making this case, an injured man rushes into the city square, he's in bandages. Like it's one of those, he's clearly been running for a while. One, because Babylon is quite a ways away from Jerusalem. But what he's coming with is this message of Jerusalem has fallen. There is no kingdom of God in the promised land anymore. And in this moment, Ezekiel has him. He breaks down. And so the rest of the book is this message of hope. God gives him a message of hope. And this looks several different ways. First, we get the message of hope for Israel. Ezekiel is told, go into this valley of dry bones. It's a desert. There's nothing here. There was once a great battle, and these bodies have been picked clean, and it's been all these skeletons are dry. It's not like they were just dead and we're bringing them back to life. They are dead. They've been dead for years. And what happens is God's Spirit comes and breathes back into what once was dead has been new life will be breathed into them, and these bones begin forming flesh. They become fully formed humans once again. And this message is continued. There's going to be hope for the nations, because God then tells that there is going to be a king, Gog, and his son Magog, of the land of Magog, and they're to come from the north, and they're going to be wicked kings, and they're going to subjugate the people. And they're going to subjugate all these nations, and yet they will be burned up from fire. There will be great hurricanes that come, and they will be flooded out. The earth will open up and swallow the pole. And just like God is breathing new life, God is also bringing destruction to you. And then you get a third message of hope, and this is for all creation. But the temple will be restored back to a state more beautiful than Solomon. This is important because this is a greater temple than is built for Jesus' time. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, the temple was only built to a minor status, and it's a point of grumbling amongst those who had been old enough to see the temple of Solomon and have now seen it, because they're dishonored. We tried so hard to rebuild Jerusalem so it's glory, and we haven't. But Ezekiel sees Jerusalem will be rebuilt to a greater status, and out of the temple will come a stream of water, and the water will rush down into the Dead Sea, and this desert place, this saltwater lake, will become teeming with life. Life will return to even the most desolate places. There will be growth in deserts. There will be water that's not just salt. The Dead Sea, like there's so much salt that you don't sink in it, and so it's one of those. All of that salt is gone. Like what has brought death, what has brought drought, all of that will be gone because new fresh water will be pouring out, which has to be a ton of water to think about scientifically, because that means you have enough to displace all of the salt that's in the water currently, but also in all of the rocks around it as well. And so, because the Dead Sea is basically salted the earth around it. And new life will be formed. Even the most places where humans have come and destroyed the earth, and where we thought of what we can look towards deforestation, all these places where like we saw it with the Dust Bowl. We over harvested the land. We burned everything up. We didn't let the ground heal. And we still have places in what was the Dust Bowl that haven't bounced back from what we have done to the earth. But God will restore even that to its former glory. And so we get kind of some lessons from this. From the judgment part, God's goodness demands justice and punishment for evil. That's why this is kind of, Ezekiel is a good place to lead people if you know where to go. Ezekiel, for the question of the problem of evil. But why doesn't God just let good things happen all the time? Well, if we have the ability to do evil, God's goodness alone demands that punishment has to happen to the wicked. Evil has to be destroyed. There is no way goodness can allow evil to prosper. And so the ways of the nations lead to destruction, right? You Israelites, you Jews, you Judeans need to get it through your head. The ways of the nations lead to destruction. We've even seen in Jesus' time, what do the Jews want to do? They want to be a power to rival Rome. That's why they're hoping the Messiah they're wanting Messiah. They're wanting a Messiah that will overthrow Rome and build the world into a godly empire, a Jewish empire, which is one, like, that throws so many people for a loop of, why didn't they just think Jesus was it? Well, because Jesus wasn't coming to establish the kingdom on earth. Like, their whole thing was tied up in this idea of we have to be like the nations. Well, God doesn't want us to be like the nations because the ways of the nations leads to destruction. And then we get some lessons from hope. God is going to be recreating creation by giving what has died through life. I think we can see kind of the quick jump into Christ's time of what once was dead. We were all dead under the trespasses of sin, but God, in his great love for us, even though we were sinners, gave his son so that we can receive that life, so that we can have that new life be breathed back into us. We can be washed clean. The living water can be poured into us, and we are no longer dead, but we are alive in Christ. And then, of course, God will bring the ultimate defeat of people. Daniel and Ezekiel are very similar in that they're very focused on the end, but Daniel is very focused on those, like, I guess you could argue, everything leading up to the end, which even then there's several who debate when the 70 weeks and what are 70 weeks, and it's 70 times 7, and math gets weird when you're trying to calculate things like that. And then you get the whole, but so like Daniel is seeing the parts where the beast, the destruction, and he's foretelling that there will be a time in which God will enter the picture. He will descend from heaven. Ezekiel is seeing the end of it. Ezekiel is seeing the end of the destruction, what is happening after everything has been destroyed. After evil's been defeated, he is seeing there's hope. A new Jerusalem will be built, which I guess it's bad to say it's a new Jerusalem. A new temple to God will be built. Ezekiel is very clear that the new city is not Jerusalem in the way that we think of Jerusalem. It's what you can even argue with John in the Revelation is John's not saying this is the same Jerusalem where it is in the Promised Land. It is a new Jerusalem, a new place, a new kingdom. And so Ezekiel's seeing that part. He's seeing there will be a new kingdom, a new temple. There will be new ways, and God will bring the final defeat of evil, but he's seeing the end of it, a recreation. He's seeing the recreative process. I somehow got through that. Next week, like I mentioned, we'll be having our mini series just for like the first 3 weeks of December, because then we get the holidays and all that. And then from January, I don't know when we'll be teaching because I have to go teach the prep class. But we'll be talking about the return from exile, and specifically Ezra. So that's where we are at. somehow gotten under the belt. But we'll see how next week goes. Any questions? I knew I flew through some of that. All right. Good. Thank you guys for being here.